Thank you all for joining us. This is Damon Johnson. I am the program manager for Georgia AIDS Education and Training Center. We'll give everybody a few more minutes to kind of roll in, and we'll start promptly around 1:05. Thank you all so much. Thanks.
This is your moderator for today, Larry Scott Walker of Thrive SS. I want you to enjoy this beautiful music. We're going to start at 105. Greetings, everyone. I am Larry Scott Walker. I am the executive director and co-founder of Thrive Support Services out of Atlanta. Thrive standing for Transforming HIV Resentments into Victories Everlasting. I almost forgot my acronym there, Alicia. Good to see you. Look beautiful today, my sister. I am honored, more than honored. I'm eager and excited to be in this space for this. Where do we go from here, building Black futures beyond the epidemic conversation? As we are featuring some amazing trailblazers and keepers of our beautiful and most sacred community. Today, just a couple of housekeeping rules. First off, just be very good to yourself. Listen to your body if you need to use the bathroom, if you need to eat, or anything like that. Second rule, please send some love and some ashes and some affirmations and blessings to these amazing presenters. Y'all have an amazing panel of presenters today, as well as we will be engaging you today via the chat box. If you have any comments or if you have any questions or things like that, please definitely ask those questions in the Q&A box as well. For today's conversation, we anticipate for the audience to be able to leave with an increased awareness around the historical foundations of medical mistrust in the African American community, as well as to be able to address the impact of that culture and faith has on health outcomes for African Americans, as well as how to use a trauma-informed lens for approaching policy as well as advocacy to build liberation and the futures after the pandemic for our Black beautiful community. Our first up to the mic, we have one of my sheroes. Her name is Alicia McKinley Beach. We were able to borrow her from Florida. Seems like she's an HIV prevention consultant as well as a capacity building trainer. She does prep trainings. For the Black population as well as Black women's initiatives. Alicia has a podcast. I can't wait to listen to her podcast coming soon about HIV. If you would like to learn more about Leisha, you can visit leisha.org. And without further ado, I just want to invite up my beautiful sister and Shiro to bless this space. Welcome, Leisha McKinley Beach.
Thank you so much, Larry. Can you all hear me? Devin, if you can hear me, give me a thumbs up. Okay.
We hear you great. Thank you.
This is such a bittersweet moment because I get the opportunity to share this space with so many folks that I call my children on today. But the reason that we are here is the bitter part of this session. What I want to do is I want to start with a story. And I was provided this young man's story by one of my colleagues, and I read it, and I could not believe that this was someone's experience in America. And as I read it, the tears just started flowing, and I said, I'm just going to keep reading this until I'm able to stop crying from this story. But that never happened. There was this young man who shared his family's experience this month, where his father was experiencing some classic symptoms for COVID-19. And they took him to an emergency department. And without even testing him, he was told that it was bronchitis. And his bronchitis was the reason why he was having these experiences, and they sent him home. And then he went to another hospital, and they told him that he could be better served at yet another hospital, and they didn't test him. And his son took him to this third emergency department. And there they didn't test him, and they sent him home. That man, his symptoms got worse. He was having difficulty breathing, and his body finally gave up the battle. And he died from this virus at home. And his family didn't get a chance to really grieve him because hours later, this young man's grandfather, who was hospitalized, also died. And while they were trying to imagine if this was a dream, the mom got ill. So they took mom to the hospital, and before she was seen, there was a young lady who came into the emergency department as well. She said that she was experiencing some symptoms, not for COVID-19, but possible food poisoning from sushi. And they chose to take her first. And then they saw the mom, and mom was hospitalized and placed on a ventilator. And then the children in the house were tested, and the daughter came back negative, and her daughter came back negative. But this young man and his brother both came back positive. And so as I read this story, I felt compelled to try to find this young man. And thank God for social media. You know, you are now, all your business is out there. And so I was able to find him, and I reached out to him this morning, and I shared with him, my condolences, but also how I was feeling reading his story. And I asked him to be a part of our webinar today so that he could feel the love from so many people who wanted to reach out and send positive energy and prayers his way. But he said something, and I said that was music to my ears. He said, I have a doctor's appointment at 1 today, so I can't join, but I'd love to talk to you later. And so I'm going to have this conversation with this young man because this should not happen. Not in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but this is a Black experience of what COVID-19 is all about. So if you would please share my slides, and then we'll move on. Okay. Our title is How Our Dark Past is Dimming the Light of Our Bright Future. And this story is an example of what shouldn't be happening in our present. But there is a very dark story from our past that gets us there. Next slide. So when we talk about where we are and some of the health decisions that are being made right now for African Americans in this country, it is no surprise that we have seen these medical models before. And so this is a story from a plantation owner who talks about one of his slaves named Patty. And he said that 80-year-old slave Patty has just died of I know not what disease. She has been saying she was sick for near a year and always pretended to be sick. But no doctor was ever summoned because Patty was no longer valuable in the fields or as a breeder. But now Martha, she's worth the $2 investment because she can still work in the fields. And every 2 years, she will produce a child, and that's how she's going to pay for her medical care. And so what we've seen even then is the survival of the fittest. And those who have outcomes that are more likely to be healthier outcomes, that there's an investment. And those who may not survive, not so much. Next slide. And so there was a document that surfaced last month from Alabama Department of Health. This was a document that was created in 2009. It was called the Criteria for Medical Ventilator Triage. And this was in case there was a pandemic like COVID-19 to happen, how will you determine who gets a ventilator and who doesn't? And so they came up with this criteria of individuals who might not qualify for a ventilator. Those were folks who had metastasized cancer, who had AIDS, severe mental retardation, just to name a few. And so it wouldn't be based on who had the most urgent need. It would truly be based on the survival of the fittest. And so I do want to take this moment also to say that there were many advocates in the state of Alabama that met with the local health departments, the state health departments, to ensure that this triage model would not be implemented during this period. So it's important for us to remember that advocacy still works. Next slide. So when folks are talking about we've never seen anything like COVID-19, that this has been a true tragedy across the country, for Black communities, we've been here before. It wasn't called COVID-19. It was called crack cocaine. It was called HIV. It was called mass incarceration. It was called poverty. For those of us who were old enough to remember a life before crack cocaine, you're also probably getting your AARP magazine every month. But there was a time before we had to deal with this drug in our community. And so we saw families all across the country be impacted by this epidemic. People who lost their lives prematurely. And that crack cocaine would become a foundation that had an impact on another epidemic that we would fight and still fighting for nearly 40 years, and that's HIV. 2018, Black people made up 42% of all new HIV cases, yet we only represent 13% of this population. When we talk about mass incarceration, we're talking about an environment where it is virtually impossible to socially isolate. Prisons become infectious disease grounds. And because of the conditions of these prisons, we put prisoners at risk. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. And so when we talk about those at risk for COVID-19 in prisons, we are talking about young Black men, older Black men, and women. There's a sitcom, an old sitcom I used to like to watch. It's called Everybody Hates Chris. And my girl, Rochelle, she would say, if she had problems on a job, she would say, I don't have to take this. My man got 2 jobs. But it's funny because her man had 2 jobs to move them just above the poverty level. And so when we think about the essential workers in this country, we have to acknowledge that so many of them look like us. Those workers, they don't have a room to self-quarantine if they become diagnosed with COVID-19 because they are working and they are doing overtime and yet can only manage to get sometimes a 2-bedroom apartment for a family of 4. How do you self-quarantine in an environment like that? When we talk about poverty, we're talking about individuals who are in communities where there are food deserts. They don't have transportation. And so if they are going to find their way to a grocery store, then they're going to have to take public transportation. And we know that that has put folks at great risk for this virus. You see, when shelter-in-place orders came down, some of them did not come down at the first of the month. Some of them came down during the middle of the month. And so when we think about our senior population who's just receiving enough income to get by, they didn't have the luxury to go out and to stock up and to prepare for shelter in place. They had to wait weeks until their next check arrived. And they depended on food banks that now so many of us who are classified at or below poverty now had to access. And so what they would be accustomed to was no longer available for them. Next slide. We can see how media can help or hurt providing information for our community. I just want to take you to this clip that came out 90 days today. This clip came out talking about 5 U.S. cases of the coronavirus. And it's quoted by saying that we don't believe that this is an immediate health risk from this new virus to the general American public. So 90 days ago, we didn't believe that this was a health risk to the general public. And now we're talking about almost 1 million people who have been diagnosed with this disease. But the reason why this article struck me was because it was such an eerie feeling, because I've seen this article before. Next slide. See, nearly 40 years ago, there was another article that came out, and it talked about 5 cases. This was the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, came out June 5th, 1981, that there were 5 cases of this mysterious virus among active homosexual men. And so if you were not gay, if you were not white, then this virus had nothing to do with you. And so here again, when we let our guard down, we have seen what happened by not raising awareness of HIV in Black communities from the very beginning. And we've been chasing for the past 40 years, trying to ensure that people are aware that this too includes you. Next slide. I've listened to many of the reports that talk about folks who are at risk. And the language that's used lets me know that there is a disconnect between our academic and public health community and our general population. This grandmother here says, my doctor ain't said I got comorbidities. She just said I got a little bit of sugar and my pressure high. So if I don't hear the language that I'm connected to, then there's no reason for me to respond. And so this is a message to those of us who are providing information and education about COVID-19 and other health issues. Use language as culturally appropriate for the populations that you are serving. Next slide. And so, do Black lives really matter? And when we look at the indicators for both health and social indicators within Black communities, it does beg the question that do Black lives really matter? When we see that before there was COVID-19, Black folks represented 77%, Blacks were 77% more likely to have diabetes than whites. And that Black women are 60% more likely to have high blood pressure than white women. And Black gay men represent 37% of all HIV cases in this country. And so these are grave underlying health conditions even before we face this new virus. And so we've talked about some of the social indicators, but you also think about housing or the lack thereof or the lack of affordable housing in this country. And then you couple that with all of the isms that we still face: racism and sexism and classism and ageism and its cousins of transphobia and homophobia. Next slide. And so what states need to do to help save us? There's a Southern term that we use that says, don't get caught with your slip showing. And I know that most folks don't wear slips, so let me give a little translation for millennials. There used to be an undergarment that you would wear so folks didn't get to see all your undergarments. But don't get caught with your slip showing. And what has happened in a great state like Georgia is the world is getting to see that our slip is showing. And so when we look at the fact that we did not expand Medicaid, and the criteria then comes down for in order to get a test for COVID-19, you need a letter from your physician to be tested. Well, my physician is the emergency department. That's where I go when I can't manage any illness at home. And now my physician, aka the emergency department, cannot see me because I don't have a letter for testing, or I waited until I couldn't breathe to come in. And as we have heard with the story from Detroit, that even with those symptoms, that does not guarantee you a test or care. And so as we talk about more testing, we got to eliminate all of these barriers for people to be able to get this test. You know, and when we look at the data, that some are saying that the decisions to open up states and jurisdictions were based on the data, I would say there's another saying that, you know, tell the truth and shame the devil, because it's hard to say that we truly know how this epidemic is impacting jurisdictions when 2/3 of all of the cases are missing race data. We have gender data, we have age, but that race data is missing from so many of these cases. I just wanted to share this statistic with you. This was a quote from a research article. It looked at 13 states across the country, many of them from the South: Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee. And the researchers stated that if Black Americans had died of COVID-19 the same rate as white Americans, 6,400 of us would still be alive. And that's just from the data from the completed demographic form. So it's necessary to be able to know our true impact from this virus by collecting complete data. Contact tracing, ensuring that folks that have come into contact or been exposed, that they are aware and they can begin social, physical isolation. Systems changes. It's not just in our healthcare that is showing why we have the outcomes that we have, but it's systems changes that are needed in housing, in education, environmental changes, criminal justice changes, and center race. You cannot have conversations about health if race is not a part of the conversation, because it helps to frame the type of infrastructure, education, services that are needed and providing them in a cultural manner. Next slide. I believe that this is my last one. What we have to do to save ourselves. Now, I know that we don't have COVID-19 experts. Nobody woke up January 1st saying that, oh, I'm going to have to get a training in this. But now many of us are going to have to become the education ambassadors in our communities about COVID-19 so that folks are aware and they can take the precautions that are needed. Continue to use gloves and masks when you're out. And I have to say this, that the one thing that scares me the most is we talk about prevention, is having Black men wearing bandanas within their communities, because we have to acknowledge police profiling. And are we putting them at a greater risk, not just of the virus, but at a greater risk of losing their lives because of police profiling? There are states that are now implementing testing that have expanded their testing. Georgia now has an app that's the AugustaHealth.org that you go and you download the app, do the screening, and they provide you with the nearest testing location at no cost to you, no copay. So it doesn't matter if you have insurance or not. These are one of the examples that are put into place. There are those of us that are going to have to become community watchdogs in terms of when we hear stories like this story I started with, where people are coming to us and saying that I did everything that I was supposed to do and they still denied me a test. That we got to build these relationships with the local and state health departments, finding folks in there that we trust and be able to say that this didn't go the way that you said it would, and that folks are still experiencing these challenges. And you know, I have a young man. He's gonna kill me because now hundreds of people are gonna be following him on Facebook. But I called Daniel Driffith and I said, you know, can I say that because you're always on social media, you know, can I say that if somebody in Georgia is having these challenges, will you serve as a liaison to get that information to the health department? And he said yes. He made me do some other work for it, but he said yes. And so then I called who I consider to be a liaison within our state health department. And I said, if you get these messages from Daniel or I, you know, about people having challenges across the state of Georgia to get tested, you know, will you elevate this to the highest level so that we can eliminate those barriers? And Michelle Allen said, yes, I will do that. And that's building your local system to be able to respond to the challenges within our community. Next slide. I want to close with this. This is a quote from Dr. King. It says that of all the forms of inequality, injustice, and health, of all the forms of inequality, injustice, and health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. What we have seen unveil before our very eyes over the past couple of months with this virus has been inhumane in many instances. You know, I had to have a conversation with my daughter who come running down the hall like she was trying out for track when she saw that restaurants and theaters were going to be open in Georgia starting today. And so I had to be the bearer of bad news that no, you will not be going to any theater on Monday. Because see, if the state capitol isn't open, but barbershops and salons are open, what message does that send to Georgians about how our health care and how we are valued in this state? So no, let's see when the Capitol opens. And if it's not a risk for the Capitol to be open, then it may not be a risk for you to go to the movies. And finally, before our next presenter comes, I just want to say that it's important that we continue to celebrate and uplift the healthcare workers, because that's very true that they're putting their lives on the line. But I do not want us to forget those custodial workers in those hospitals, our city bus drivers, our folks working in the grocery stores, and our postal workers, because, see, they are essential employees as well, and they put their lives on the line every day. And so as you continue to celebrate healthcare workers, tell one of those other essential workers, thank you for your service. Thank you so much.
Ashe, Ashe, thank you so much for that, Leisha. Thank you for covering that history, the epigenetics involved, and then also the way that our lives are not valued, but the ways that we can value and show up for ourselves. I absolutely love you, and I appreciate that life that this world has you in it. I have been tapped to offer a poetic offering at this time. This is a poem that I wrote called "God is in the Streets." Before we bring up our next presenter, God is in the streets. He's holding a sign that reads, "Hands up, don't shoot." God is that sister you claimed looked like a prostitute because she wasn't wearing a pantsuit. God is that brother, that thug they thought up to no good. See, God is somewhere getting wet up by the fire hydrant in the worst parts of the hood. God is in the streets, probably millie whopping or twerking for dear life. See, God is that loser who can't seem to get it right. God is that husband who won't keep it in his pants. See, God is that femme son who dared to take a stance. God is in the streets. He's somewhere trapped in the wrong body, praying for escape. God is silently pulling himself together again, recovering from a rape. See, but you ain't hear it from me because I heard God be in these streets. See, she should have probably seen it coming. No pun intended. God should need to crawl up out of his feelings. He's so easily offended. See, God is that faggot, that tranny, that hoe. God is those people that you really don't want to know. See, God is in the streets and he got his peace and he wishing a nigga would. God got that work, got that perk, got that good. God got that is that cousin who always got your back. God is that uncle who won't let you forget. See, come here. I don't care how many degrees you get. You black. See, God is in the streets. He got some great cornrows and he's on a little girl's bike. See, God is that sister that don't nobody really like. What's her name? Lakeisha. She always in the streets talking about she got 0 F's to live. God is in the streets and he got less than a minute to live. God is being profiled by a wannabe cop. God just got pulled over. God just got shot. They're just going to let God's body lie on the street for hours that feel like weeks. See, God is bleeding out. This is why young gods protest in peace. They sit in class and can't focus for trying to figure what it's all about. They heard that there was a rally, they go and check it out. It's at that rally they decide to stand and affirm their own life. See, gods decide to stand. God decides to fight. See, God is also that brother who's so past race. He's like, what about black on black crime? This rioting and marching is a waste. See, God is an OJ. God is a Kanye. God is a Gabby. God is a Gabourey. Just like God is in Draymond, God was in Trayvon, and anyone our eyes can train on, especially those ones we hate. See, God is our commonality, and God is how we relate. And God ain't somewhere sitting on a cloud granting wishes. God is in the streets. It is with pleasure that I bring up this next hero of mine, Mr. Bishop Oliver Clyde Allen III is a religious trailblazer, an author, human rights advocate, and an international and community leader and entrepreneur. In 2015, he was appointed to be a part of the Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, PACHA. 2016, he was appointed to the southeastern chair of the DNC LGBT advisory board. He is the bishop of Atlanta. We love him so much, and the executive director and of the Vision Community Foundation. Without further ado, I bring up this amazing light in our community, Mr. O.C. Allen. Thank you so much. You're muted, Bishop. Let me see if I can unmute you. Oh,
Thank you, Larry and Leisha. And it is such a pleasure and an honor to just very briefly be a part of this discussion. Again, I will be just very brief, and I'm only going to be sharing just what's on my heart. I am not a scientist. I am not a doctor. I am not a medical professional. I am a pastor. I am also a victim and a survivor of COVID-19, the coronavirus. Many of you know that I was hospitalized and I was in the isolation ward at Northside Hospital for more than a week with a very life-threatening situation. I want to first say thank you so much for your prayers. Those of you new and those of you who are praying for me and sending me positive energy, sending me every vibration of healing, strength that you could. I cannot tell you how much I know that prayer works, vibrations work, love works, unity works. And so I want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. My voice is weak, but I'm still here. My voice is weak, but I am still here. I want to say, Alicia, your presentation was so profound, so in depth, and so incredible. However, I am not an epidemiologist. This is probably one of the first times I've even spoken outside of our online services for the past couple of weeks. But I love you all, and I am so appreciative to be a part of the conversation. Again, I'm not an epidemiologist, Larry. I'm not a public health specialist. I'm just a leader of people and people in the community who are part of what we're doing. And I will say that I know close hand, up close, what this is. I was diagnosed on the 24th March, but I had been incredibly ill and sick and was admitted into the hospital 5 days prior to that. This has been a very long and arduous road of recovery. I'll tell you why I am sharing this with you, and then I will end. The recovery and the road to recovery is much longer and equally arduous in its own way as the actual virus. I would not wish this on anyone, and there's so many who have had coronavirus and were asymptomatic, didn't know they had it, didn't have the symptoms that I had and so many others. Myself included, so many people were on the brink of losing their lives and have been and have lost their lives. We send love and compassion to those who have lost their lives due to this, to the families. One thing that this has done is has made us, hopefully, sensitive to global suffering. All of us who work in any area of public health, addressing health disparities on the front lines of HIV and AIDS, sometimes it is easy to get into a bubble, get in your own public health bubble, and to not see the suffering. On the other side of the street are so many people who are in their own life bubbles and don't see the suffering, and those that have had to endure HIV and AIDS and so many of the other health disparities in our society that affect Black people, that impact Black people. And I'll tell you this, while we, as usual, share the great burden of the coronavirus, there's so many around the globe that are being impacted by this. And this is why I believe so many people are becoming sensitive to, or at least being more aware, conscious of human suffering. We are now all on lockdown. We are all in quarantine. We are all in the same place in some way. And so there has been a lot of suffering and of that. But if I would share another perspective, this is also making us deeply aware. It has raised our cultural competency and awareness. And I believe that we are more aware of each other than we have ever been. I would encourage you to understand that being proactive about this, staying home and following the guidelines that our CDC and our great mayor have put in place are not just about you. I know that the slogan, stay home and stay alive, is out there and it's important. But the reality is that many young people, majority, would be asymptomatic, and a lot of people don't know. But this is not even just about you. It's about the community around you and the most vulnerable, our seniors. There's so many demographics in our community that are at a disadvantage when we are not conscious and aware of ourselves, taking care of our personal health, which impacts our public health. And so it's important to know that. And I know that this has been incredibly frustrating, being in quarantine, social distancing, but social distancing does not mean social disconnection. Social distancing does not mean social disconnection. And so the first thing I will say is that, beyond what I've already said, that there are so many ways for us to connect to each other and to continue to connect to each other as we become profoundly aware and cognizant and sensitive to our lives and the lives of others, particularly being surrounded by so much sickness, death. I was deeply, deeply disappointed to see pictures of people who are gathering together. Just as late as yesterday, at parks and spaces without social distance, without masks, without the proper distancing between each other in public. Those things will impact others and can impact our lives. I am a witness of this. And so I implore you, I ask you to follow the guidelines as much as possible. And I know many of us are unable to stay home. Many of us are on the front lines of the economy, driving the economy as bad as it is. We are essential. Many of us are on jobs that are essential. But I ask that you please, I beg you, for the sake of the community, for the sake of your families, for the sake of our future and our community, to please, please follow the guidelines that have been set out for us. It can impact in a positive and healthy and wholesome and holistic way, or it can absolutely impact someone's very ability to live. This has created a collective trauma, and it's not just for those of us who have actually contracted or healing from coronavirus, but there is also, for those of us who are watching this webinar, to be deeply, deeply, deeply sensitive to the fact that this collective trauma has impacted everyone's mental health. And so as we journey through this, as we journey out of it, because this too shall pass, as we journey out of it, it will be critical that those of us who are on the front line of public health in HIV and AIDS, the public health, as we are doing our best to sound the alarm, advocates and activists, to understand that collective trauma creates collective mental health challenges. And we need to be very thoughtful of that. What is our strategy and plan? Because as you know, many who maybe have been in treatment now with this added layer, there are many that are struggling now with all of the disparities and all of the challenges with staying in treatment or getting into treatment or getting tested. If we've had any challenges before, this is now even greater, but this impacts our mental health. For those of us who have contracted the coronavirus, and people who have contracted coronavirus and HIV positive or have a host of pre-existing conditions, what does that mean on our mental health? What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? And so we have to stay on the forefront of not just understanding our role in public health and pushing the initiatives and the policies and doing the advocacy that we have been doing, but we also have to make mental health a priority. The last thing I believe with you, I am a man of faith. I am a man of faith, and whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, or Hindu, or maybe you don't practice any particular faith, that's all, any particular religion, I know that all of us believe in something, even if it's just love. So I want to leave you with just a few things as we journey through this. First of all, keep praying for me. Keep praying for me. I need all of your prayers. But I want to switch gears. As a man of faith, you asked the preacher to come on here and to talk a little bit about what is on my heart. I don't have slides. I don't have a presentation so much, but I have what's on my heart. And I want to tell you, you still have wings. You still have wings. You still have wings, even in this pandemic. We have wings. I say this because, as Felicia laid out so beautifully, we have always had pandemics. The pandemic of racism, the pandemic of all of the health disparities that we've had to experience since we have been in this country, 400 years of pandemics. We are no stranger to pandemics. We are no stranger to illness and sickness and all of this. No strangers to this. But in every age and every season, there have been warriors and pioneers that decided to not let the pandemic, to not let racism or discrimination, to not let fear cage them, to cage their wings. This time is no different than any other, I'm telling you. Use your wings. This is the time to rediscover and recover your wings. I implore you and I ask you that as we are quarantined and locked in our homes, those of us that can, and even while you are trying to figure out your next move, don't allow this economy, don't allow the lack of a stimulus check, don't allow the lack of the resources that you've had, don't allow this moment or this time, don't allow sickness or death or any of the struggles in our community to cage and hold down your wings. If there was any time to lean into your vision and lean into your goals, to lean into who you are, and to lean into your destiny, the time is now. Whether it is a book, whether it is legislation or policy, or whether it is going into politics, whether it is being a better parent, whether it is being a better child, whether it is being a better woman or man on this planet and fulfilling your purpose, don't forget your wings. You've been in a pond. You've been in a pond. We've all been in a pond. I ask you to lean into the ocean of possibility. Lean into the ocean of possibility. And I will say this last thing as I close. Don't wait for the pandemic to be over. Don't wait for things to go back to the way that things used to be. For you to find your joy, for you to find your inner excellence and your inner self and your inner peace. Things will never be the way they used to be. Things don't have to be the way they used to be. We are now living in a new normal. But you were created for this moment. Forgive me for sounding so spiritual talk, but that's who I am. I want to just give you hope. I am a survivor of this because of the love of community. Healthcare workers, they did small things. They got me through. I was in quarantine, so I was unable to talk to anyone other than be on FaceTime. The nurses would make sure I had some FaceTime to see my husband, talk to my mother, and see my kids. But I will tell you, one day a nurse came in the room and held my hand. Just held my hand. She wasn't supposed to. She wasn't drawing blood. She wasn't taking my temperature. I am a man of faith, but I was scared for my life. Thought I would lose my life. And someone held my hand. And so for those of you who are overwhelmed by all of the data, for those of us that are trying to find a solution to this, to help our community, where do we go from here? And there's so many things that you're going to hear. Don't forget, it's the simple things also that matter. Someone held my hand and they gave me hope. And so, thank you for your time. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Alicia. You are my heroes. Keep me in your prayers. It's the data and all of the knowledge that will move us forward, but it's also the small things. Thank you for your poem, because God is a mystery.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Thank you for reminding us of our resiliency. Thank you for reminding us that we still have our wings amidst all of the craziness, all of the things that we're up against. But thank you additionally for giving us wings. You, for so many people, including myself, are a possibility model, a potential model of a life of liberation. I love you. I send light for you. Anybody on this call, please pray for our brother. Continue to send strength and power to our brother. Speaking of possibility models, up next we have Devin Barrington Ward. This is like one of my little brothers in his work. I love this brother. Devin's been lending us his blessings and his determination to lead us towards freedom and justice since the age of 16. He has worked so hard to try to transform and empower Black and Brown communities. You may know Devin as being the executive director and founder of the Black Futurist Group. The Black Futurist Group, along with some other amazing Black-led organizations, help to repurpose the jail. You may also remember Devin from petitioning and being arrested, petitioning Kemp's stealing of the gubernatorial race. We thank Devin and we love Devin. I can't wait to hear him present on trauma-informed public policy and advocacy. Public policy and advocacy that, realizes the impact on trauma on our communities, that, recognizes when it's happening and that creates a response to trauma. So without further ado, I would like to invite up my brother, one of my heroes as well, Devin Barrington Ward.
Thank you. I appreciate you so much, Larry, Leisha, my bishop, as I am a 10-year member of the Vision Church, maybe even longer than that. But it is a privilege and an honor to be on the call today with so many folks. I think that it is amazing that we are still able, and it's a blessing that we're able to still connect with one another. And while we are physically distant, that does not mean that we have to actually be socially distant. And I've got so much joy being able to hear my bishop provide us with really the fuel that we need to get the work done that we're all supposed to be doing. I do think and believe that during this time, this is a really great opportunity to look introspectively around where are the pieces we can, as individuals, contribute to our collective liberation and freedom, and then also to be thinking collectively as a community and as a people what our pathways forward towards liberation and freedom, and how we build that beloved community that we have all thought about, that we've all dreamed about. It is so close, and we shouldn't allow the pandemic to rob us of the possibility of tomorrow and the future that we have to fight for. So as Larry has said, my name is Devin Barrington Ward. I serve as the managing director of the Black Futurist Group. We are a for-profit entity that does nonprofit consulting work in the areas of policy and advocacy. And so we work in a variety of areas as it pertains to advancing Black futures. And the reason why we are called the Black Futurist Group is because we don't believe that there is a future for anybody if there is no future that is safe and secure for Black people. And so it is imperative that we do the work to build the futures of Black people, because that is how we build the future of the world. And so the Black Futurist Group, we build Black futures as our contribution to the larger work around our collective struggle for freedom and liberation as humanity outside of Blackness. And so we can start advancing the slides. You see the Black Futurist Group. The Black Future is here. Trauma-informed public policy and advocacy, which are the building blocks for the future. Next slide. Am I advancing the slides?
Do you not see the slides moving, Devin?
I don't see them moving on my page. Hold on. Nope.
There? No?
Mm-mm.
So? See, it's moving on my screen, but it's not. Okay, 1 second.
Yeah, folks are saying in the chat box they aren't moving.
Oh no, jeez.
All right, there we go. So I love this quotation by the American scholar, the Black American scholar, Frederick Douglass, who once stated that those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men and women who want crops without the plowing up of the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean, without the awful roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and struggle. Or it may be both moral and physical, but there must be a struggle. And the full quotation continues saying, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. I know for many of us in a lot of community organizing spaces and spaces where we are organizing to build the futures of our community, where we are fighting against the oppression that has continued to plague us, that, like Leisha said, this pandemic is nothing new. And we are professing freedom, and we have professed freedom for quite some time. But we can't not profess freedom without also appreciating the need to agitate, without also appreciating the rain, the thunder, and the lightning, the ocean and its awful roar of its many waters. If that doesn't describe the time that we are in right now as a people, given this pandemic, I don't know what does. But even with all of that being said, even with all of the lightning, the rain, the awful roar of the waters of the ocean, all of the lightning, we still must profess freedom. We must not be deterred. And so I hope that that quotation provides some inspiration as we do the work of building our futures. Next slide. So who is the Black Futurist Group, and what is the Black Futurist Framework? As I said, we are a policy, advocacy, and political strategists who are using innovation, imagination, and creativity to build Black futures. We do this out of the belief that Black life is valuable, precious, and worth protecting, and that Black empowerment is a necessary element in the larger struggle for the collective rights of all people. We work with those standing at the intersection of varying cultural, ethnic, and gender identities across diverse communities to build, preserve, and improve and advance Black futures. The advancement of Black futures is the advancement of the future. And so one way that I love to sum that up is from the great songstress and prophetess Erykah Badu. When asked about the future, she says, I believe that there is a future, and there is a future where Black people are in it. And that is to be a Black futurist And so if you believe that there is a future and Black people are in that future and that we deserve to be there, then we will fight for that future, and we will do the work to create that future. Next slide. So a little bit about me. I founded the Black Futurist Group in 2018. Prior to that, I come to the Black Futurist Group with a breadth of experiences in the political and community organizing space. So I've served as a former communications director, campaign manager, chief of staff. I am a registered lobbyist. Well, previously I was a registered lobbyist, and I am a Black futurist. And to add to number 6, I'm also a candidate for public office. I'm running for state senate in this upcoming June 9th primary here in the state of Georgia in District 38. Thank you, Larry. And so that is a part of the pieces of me that I'm bringing to this collective work. And so it was really exciting to put my name on the ballot, and really exciting to run this campaign, even though we have to run this campaign in an era where politicians can't shake people's hands. So this is also very interesting as well. So please send me strength. Next slide. So what is public policy and why does it matter? Public policy can generally be defined as a system of laws, regulatory measures, ordinances, funding priorities that concern a given topic that comes up from the government, its representatives, or its citizens. Individuals and groups often attempt to share and shape public policy through education, awareness, lobbying, and the mobilization of special interests and community groups. Now, trauma-informed public policy is public policy that is developed from from an approach that seeks to build connections, establish communication, and facilitate healing. I want to say that one more time. Trauma-informed public policy is public policy that is developed through an approach that seeks to build connections, establish communication, and facilitate healing. Public policy that is developed through a trauma-informed lens acts directly impacted communities to convey in their own words what has happened to them rather than attempting to find out what's wrong with these people. It connects the conditions of the communities to its social and structural conditions and seeks to understand how it informs the trauma and the response to that trauma rather than isolating their conditions and assuming that it is a flaw specific to this community. And so that's why it's really important that we talk about trauma-informed public policy in this time. We were really fortunate. The Black Futurists Group works with a lot of different organizations. We're really fortunate that we are in a contract with the University of Houston, where we are facilitating for the next few months until September, where we are facilitating 5 organizations across the South in a public policy, trauma-informed public policy and advocacy shared learning institute. So we're teaching organizations the importance of not just approaching public policy and advocacy from this very traditional framework that oftentimes does not move community forward, but from a trauma-informed lens, just like we need to be applying that into our medical system and the system of healthcare, and to recognize that trauma informs all things, including public policy. And if we really want to change the lives of people in community, then we cannot offer public policy without having a true understanding of the trauma and the historical nature of the challenges that these communities are facing, that our communities are facing. Next slide. Okay, so why capacity in public policy and advocacy is important for community-based organizations and aid service organizations and other providers. And the reason why it's important is because you all play a very vital role in the development and implementation of public policy to build healthy futures. Service providers, you all witness and respond to the impacts of both negative and positive public policy on marginalized people that you all are serving, whether they are patrons of an art program or the recipient of HIV services or the residents of a homeless shelter. Few institutions are closer to the real problems of people than you all as service providers. And so service providers are the bridge between policymakers, government agencies, and their constituents. Effective advocacy builds on your capacity to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people and communities you serve by creating a legislative and regulatory environment for the most optimal health outcomes. So oftentimes, when we talk about lobbyists and people who are influencing public policy, not all lobbyists wear a solutions, not punishment collaborative shirt, right? A lot of lobbyists are lobbying for corporate interests, are lobbying for greed, are lobbying to uphold these broken institutions and structures around our healthcare system, economics, and housing. But oftentimes they do that so that they can create an environment, right, legislatively, regulatorily, an environment where the laws are the most beneficial to their profit margins. What I am saying is we as the people who are responsible for fighting and protecting the future of our community, we must do the same, but to ensure that the laws and the political environment is the most optimal for our people to have the best health outcomes and to experience wellness in every sense of the word. Next slide. All right. So just a little bit, a little information. I won't stay on this too long, but lobbying and advocacy are not interchangeable. Generally speaking, advocacy encompasses many different activities designed to promote a cause or idea, while lobbying refers to a very specific activity that is intended to influence a specific piece of legislation or rules that are governing these activities. Nonprofits, whether they are 501c3s or 501c4s, are allowed to engage in lobbying activities, although the rules are stricter for 501c3s. There are no limits on the amount a 501c4 can spend on lobbying activities. However, federal law prohibits 501c3 charitable organizations from spending a substantial part of their time and budget on lobbying. So unless your organization is engaged in a substantial amount of lobbying, you are unlikely to come close to the financial limits. So with that being said, the reason I incorporated that slide is one of the common misconceptions is that nonprofits are not allowed to lobby or engage in any sort of government advocacy with elected officials, and that is not true. Not only is that not true, but it's actually dangerous for our people because, again, you all as service providers providing these vital services to people in our community on a daily basis know where the needs are. You know when the policy isn't working. You know when the law that this legislator that wants to give themselves a pat on the back has passed something, and you know that it hasn't really hit the intention as far as how it is supposed to impact the lives of the people that you all are serving. So for you not to be able to convey how this law is not serving the community in the best ways would really limit the type of care that we're able to provide to our people. And again, limit the opportunity to create that ideal legislative, regulatory law, ideal laws for the environment in terms of our ability to provide the best care for our people. So it is really important that you be in a practice where you are comfortable with engaging with legislators. In Black Futures Group, we give a whole training for that for folks who are interested in getting some more information and getting more involved in advocacy, policy, and lobbying as a nonprofit organization doing this work. Next slide. All right, so BFG's approach to public policy and advocacy, we always want you all to remember to be strategic. That means figure out what your SMART goals are, right? Specific, measurable, actionable, time-bound. We also want it to be intersectional, right? So that it doesn't, because we know our people don't live one experience or one issue lives. And so oftentimes the issues that are reflective in our healthcare system also are issues and challenges that reflect in our system of housing, in our system of unequitable economic development. And so we want to make sure that we're speaking to the needs of the full person. And in order to do that, it should be intersectional. We also want it to be collaborative, right? We want it to be grounded in equity and liberation. It should be grounded in active listening, learning, sharing, and building of community. It should be bold and transformative. If your public policy and advocacy is only incremental and there is no Cadillac version of what it is that you're trying to do, then you don't have the big picture that you're the thing on your wall that you dream and you work towards, so that keeps you inspired while you're doing these incremental policy changes, right? It also needs to be trauma informed, and it should build power. It should build power. If you are doing policy and advocacy work and the people that you're doing the policy and advocacy work with are not reflective of the community, then you're not building power. If the people that you're doing public policy and advocacy work with don't learn a new skill set, right, then you aren't building power, because you don't want to just mobilize people for this fight. You want to be able to mobilize people for this fight and for the fight after that. And you want to be able to have people who are inspired to mobilize themselves around these particular issues, so that way it doesn't always sit with one person or one organization, right? And so then in our Black Futures Toolbox, coalition building is the main piece of our Black Futures Toolbox: political strategy, media engagement, public policy development, legislative advocacy, and lobbying. And then, of course, what we're doing right now, which is the training, technical assistance, and capacity building assistance. Next slide. So I'm going to breeze through these really, really quickly, but if you are really serious about building the future through public policy and advocacy, you want to go through some of these steps. First, you want to set a goal. So whenever you're launching an advocacy effort or a campaign, you should always start with setting a goal, but the goal should be realistic and it should be winnable, right? Your overarching vision should be very broad, right? So the overarching vision for the movement for Black Lives, for example, is the liberation of Black people. Ooh, that's not a campaign, that's a vision, because that is a very big picture item, right? But it's what keeps you inspired, so that way when it's time to do the work around police accountability, or it's time to do the work around the expansion of Medicaid, or it's time to do the work to end HIV through, scaling up the availability of PrEP and ensuring that people who are living with HIV have access to the medication that they need. Those are the goals that support that larger vision that you should be working towards, because it's really important that advocacy is viewed as a marathon and not a sprint or a race, right? So again, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. Smart. Next slide. You also want to create a message that resonates with people and that is well thought out. So that means that it's not a message that is created in a vacuum. It's a message that's receptive and respectful of other audiences, and you want to make sure that your message can educate, engage, and influence folks. You also want to make sure that your message is easy to understand for people who are supporting you and the people who you are targeting, right? So your message should not only inspire people's thoughts, but it should also inspire people to act, which means that it should be easy to share. And so when you're evaluating your message, you want to make sure that it's credible, that it's clear, that it's concise, that it connects with people, and that it communicates your values. Also, a good message provides a demand, it provides a target, and it provides an opportunity for how people can act in support of those demands and support of advocating either for or against or towards that target. And when I talk about the target, for example, if we were advocating around the expansion of testing in Georgia for COVID-19, our target would be, I really don't want to say his name, the governor of Georgia. Our target would be the governor of Georgia, because as Larry mentioned before, I got arrested in 2018 after he stole the election. So he's like Voldemort. I really try not to say his name. And so in that case, for example, I'll give you another real example. Recently, Leisha brought this up. We talking about the bandanas and the face coverings. Did you know that in Georgia, we have a law that unless you have written permission from the owner of any public establishment, you cannot enter into that establishment with a mask or any sort of face covering. Luckily, we were able to get that information out to folks. I put out a call along with Senator Nikema Williams, who was also my cellmate in 2018, and folks with the NAACP to call the governor's office to demand that that law be temporarily suspended during this public health emergency. And it was. So now in Georgia, while this public health emergency runs, police will not be able to enforce that law that makes it illegal for folks to wear face coverings and masks. But for a lot of folks, I was hesitant at wearing masks at first, because while I did not know about that specific law, I do know that I am a Black man in America, and that as a Black person, my existence is oftentimes criminalized, and to add any additional layer onto that could potentially put my life in jeopardy or greater jeopardy than COVID-19. And so again, we were able to do that through a very clear message to call the governor's office and demand that that law be suspended. Next slide. And then you also want to recruit a team. And I'm not going to talk about this too much right now, but while you are, being physically distant but not socially distant, this is a great time to do an assessment of what skills are available to you as you're looking to advance and move forward either these very COVID-19 specific advocacy efforts, or you're looking to move forward advocacy efforts in general, because we're still going to have to deal with mass incarceration. We're still going to have to deal with the HIV epidemic. And so this is now another piece of the work that we have to add on top of that. But when you're looking for skill sets, you want to make sure that you have folks who can organize in the field or organize on social media. You want to make sure that you've got people who can engage in that very robust research. So I know one person, for example, who's already been called on the call, but Daniel Driffin. He is, if you are doing an advocacy effort, you want to get with him on the research because he's really good at that stuff. Traditional and social media engagement. Also, people who can sit and hold strategy. Strategy and strategy sessions are really, really important, and the facilitation of that is a special skill. Public speaking, fundraising, volunteer management, and also the negotiation. Who's going to help be the closer for whatever deal it is that you have to make with the entity that you are advocating either for or against or with. And so, for example, if you are wanting to organize around a people's recovery package for COVID-19, who are going to be the people in the room when it's time to talk with the government officials, either at the city, the county, the state, or in Washington, D.C., who are going to be the people who handle those type of negotiations, right? And these are some of the things that oftentimes people don't think about when they're doing advocacy, because oftentimes it requires a rapid response. But if we are in a practice of having those structures and having that bank of resources as far as human power available, then we can be in a better practice where we can plug and play those skill sets. Next slide. And then you, of course, want to determine your timeline. So is the timeline for what you're asking for realistic? Does it leave room for unforeseen events, right? I am going through this right now as a candidate for public office. We had a whole campaign plan that started in January when we announced, and by March, we had to throw that entire campaign plan out because we were not able to do door-to-door, work community meetings, all of the different things. Now, you may say that, well, that's different for someone who's running for office. Absolutely not. Notice I said advocacy campaign. So whether it's a campaign for public office, or it's a campaign to get a particular bill passed, or it's a campaign to get legislators to be aware of this particular issue, these are all campaigns, which means that there should be a plan attached to it, which means that it should be adaptable to unforeseen events, right? Also find out, can your coalition and the people you're organizing with, can they commit to this timeline? Is this the season for my issue, right? We're going through this right now. We also do marijuana advocacy work, cannabis advocacy work. We're funded by Drug Policy Alliance to do equitable marijuana cannabis expansion in the state of Georgia to ensure that Black and brown people who have been impacted by the war on drugs are able to also take in the profits of this $23 billion legal cannabis industry in the United States. With that being said, many of our cannabis advocates have been talking about how right now with COVID-19, this may not be the time for very robust efforts towards legalization, but there may be other areas where we can be impactful. And so that's understanding the season that you're in right now. And then also, how is your timeline impacted by any fundraising needs, if any? Next slide. I'm going to skip over this slide. Next slide. All right. So just some additional considerations. We want you to make sure that you understand the basics, the 3 branches of government, right? I know that might seem really, really basic, but for a lot of folks, civics education has not necessarily been as robust as it should be, and it's intentional because for people who do not know their government structure cannot hold their government accountable, right? But the information is there and available for you to find out. So the three branches of government, the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, also recognize that those branches of government are oftentimes reflected not just at the federal level, but at the state and even at the local level as well. So also understanding the structure of your local government, right? In Georgia, for example, our state government does kind of mirror the federal structure. So we have a bicameral legislative system. Bicameral means that we have a state House of Representatives, and we have a state Senate. We have an executive branch that's represented by the governor's office, and we have a judicial branch with various courts. Just like at the federal level, we have a state Supreme Court, we have state appeals courts, we have superior courts, and other municipal courts that are part of our judicial structure. And then also understanding the legislative process. We don't have the time, but I would encourage folks to YouTube Schoolhouse Rock if you just need a reminder on how a bill becomes a law, because that gives you a great kind of basis for basically most legislative process, whether it be in Congress or at the state level or at the city level, reflect the process that's outlined in Schoolhouse Rock. And it's also just a really fun video to watch. Just a bill on Capitol Hill. It's pretty good fun. So also select and research your target. So who are you targeting for your advocacy demand, right? So that means you need to find out who represents you, not just your governor, not just your mayor, but who's on city council, who's your state senator, who's your state representative. You want to find out their voting record. So how have they voted on things in the past? So for example, if you voted for a bailout for banks and corporations, thank you, Daniel. See, this is why Daniel is a part of the beloved community. Schoolhouse Rock is in the chat box, so by all means, go and check it out. But for example, if a person has voted previously for, a bailout or for tax incentives for businesses before COVID-19, then most certainly I should be able to expect your vote, should be is the operative word, for a bailout package for the people, right? Or for a bailout package for hospitals or for the expansion of Medicaid. But you can't make those arguments if you don't know the person's voting record. The voting record also will help you establish if there's any common ground, if any. You'll be surprised. Sometimes I will walk into meetings with folks who are from other areas of the state, who have an R by their name, who I think we have nothing in common. And I find out that, wow, while we are different, sometimes we are the same, but also we are not the same. Understand their interests and determine who and what influenced them. So that's power mapping. We do a really great training on power mapping, which is really just figuring out who are all the different players as it pertains to your legislative environment in your state, and figuring out who are the different connection points and how their role or responsibility may impact your advocacy efforts. And then you want to research the environment and the season. So what's the status of the issue at the legislature? Is this a good year? Next slide. All right, so I'm going to walk through some examples really quickly of trauma-informed public policy work. It looks like I'm singing there. I'm not. It's a part of a video. If you go to the Black Futurist Group's website, I can't type it in the chat box right now, but if somebody would be nice enough to type in Black Futurist with an S, blackfuturistgroup.com, you can go to the website and you will see the video there on our Close the Jail campaign that we were a part of supporting with Women on the Rise, which is an organization led by formerly incarcerated women. Shout out to Marilyn Wynn. And then also, thank you, Evan. So Black Futurist Group is in the chat box. So we worked on that campaign with Women on the Rise, Racial Justice Action Center, and SNAPCO, Solutions Not Punishment Collaborative, on a campaign to close and repurpose the Atlanta City Detention Center that is still ongoing. So we're still contracted to do that work. And while we have gotten the population of the city jail reduced from 700 people just a year ago to just about 15 people that are in the jail on any given day. Now, this is a 400,000 square foot facility that was built before it was the first Olympics facility built in Georgia for the 1996 Summer Olympics. I know, whoa. And this facility was built under a Black mayor and a Black city council. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes that the city of Atlanta had made, because it wasn't a jail. You didn't go there if you raped somebody. You didn't go there if you murdered somebody. You didn't go there if you pulled a gun out on somebody. This jail held people on city ordinance violations. So driving on a suspended license, less than 2 ounces of marijuana, spitting on the sidewalk, jaywalking, pedestrian in the motorway, solicitation of sex. So these are crimes where we would often describe them as victimless crimes. And so who it targets is overwhelmingly, we found that there were Black LGBTQ folks there. Another disturbing statistic was that over 90% of the marijuana arrests and bookings in the jail were Black people in the city of Atlanta. 90%. And we only make up about 53% of the city of Atlanta's population of Black people. And so that was insane. And so that was a trauma-informed campaign because it was in response to the needs of formerly incarcerated folks, specifically formerly incarcerated women. It was a campaign that also led to the decriminalization of marijuana. And that was prompted because of DeAndre Phillips, a Black father who was gunned down by an Atlanta police officer only because he smelled marijuana in Mr. Phillips' car, right? And also this was built on the trauma of Black sex workers in the city of Atlanta who had previously been the subject of a potential ordinance that would have banished them from the city of Atlanta, right? Very Babylon style. Yes, decriminalization needs to be at the federal and the state level, absolutely. But very banishment style, very Babylon, very Old Testament style of how we were going to handle people engaging in survival sex work. And so this campaign culminated with all of those experiences of those folks who experienced these various traumas, who contributed to this campaign and led to this facility now being empty and being moved towards a repurposing process. Originally, we were thinking about it being a center for equity and a community resource center, but we're actually having some conversations about how that potentially could be converted into a hospital to help take some of the burden off of Grady Hospital and Atlanta Medical Center downtown. I am standing next to Keisha, our mayor. Yes, Keisha is the mama of Georgia who has said, wait, what your dad said you could go outside? You're not going outside. So shout out to Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms. I'm standing with her along with members of, and Ms. Marilyn is in the red. She is the executive director of Women on the Rise. And so that was the press conference where we announced that we would be moving towards the closure of the Atlanta City Detention Center, which the sign you see right behind you. Next, we have a photo with a bipartisan photo where I'm standing between two women. The first woman is Representative Sharon Cooper, who is the chair of Health and Human Services. And I'm standing next to my beloved State Representative Park Cannon, one of the youngest state representatives in the state of Georgia, a Democrat who worked with me and this Republican legislator to get our PrEP drug assistance bill passed. We still got some work to do on that because we've got to put money in the budget for it, but this authorizes the Department of Public Health to create a PrEP drug assistance program, pilot program, so that low-income people can access PrEP in Georgia at no cost. Next slide. Thank you. Now let's build the future together, because whether or not you may feel it today, I recognize that the challenges that are coming along with COVID-19 are some of the things that we had never envisioned, but I believe that the future is ours, and it is not our responsibility to predict the future, but it is our responsibility to create the future. And so with that being said, I believe that we can build this future for everybody. And remember, even though we are the Black Futurist Group, the Black future is for everybody. So again, my name is Devin Barrington Ward, the Managing Director of the Black Futurist Group and candidate for Georgia State Senate District 38. You can reach out to me or other members of the team, Jerome Bryant, who is the Chief of Staff, Ryan Roll, who's our Senior Strategist, and we have a new staff person, Jamae Rooks, who's our Special Assistant, who's also on our website. Please connect with us on IG, Facebook, and Twitter. And by all means, visit our website, theblackfuturistgroup.com. And remember, the Black future is for everybody, because there's no future without us. And with that, I turn it back over to my brother and my friend, Larry. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Devin, for this and your commitment to our community. As I did the math, I'm like, you've been doing this almost half your life.
Yes.
Jeez, thank you for your commitment. Also, thank you for bringing Schoolhouse Rock's back. It's in my head now. I'm just a bit along Capitol Hill. I love the bluesy. Guys, y'all have to watch Schoolhouse Rock.
I have to do something for the old head.
Yeah, see, and like that, I have been transgressed against. And the concept of trauma-informed advocacy and policy, I love that. But it's not what is wrong with you, but it's what's wrong with the place that is supposed to be taking care of you.
Correct.
The things that have happened to us are in response to that. Thank you so much for that. And, being ageist. No, I'm just joking. Love you, my brother. Now we're going to open it up for question and answers. We got some questions. My brother Damon Johnson is going to come up and facilitate this portion. I definitely saw a question around asking what some trauma-informed advocacy examples are. So, Devin, if you wanted to start with some of those.
Say that one more time for me.
Some trauma-informed public policy examples that you may have.
So, for example, in the areas of criminal justice reform, a trauma-informed example would be, so in Chicago and D.C., as they are they are writing their legalization framework as they build out how, cannabis is legalized in Chicago, for example. And in Illinois. So we know that Black communities have experienced trauma from the war on drugs, right? And that trauma is reflected in the arrest rates. That trauma is reflected in the amount of people, of our people who are in prison. That trauma is very abundant and clear. We still need to speak to people about their experiences with, the war on drugs. But we have a sense of where that trauma emanates from. And so to develop a legalization framework that is informed by that trauma, that means record restriction, right? So we know that people have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. We want to restrict people's record, the access to people's prior convictions of cannabis. We also want to make sure that we are giving special loans, right, and incentives for people to be able to start their own cannabis business, right? Because we know that there are barriers because being Black, being victims of the criminal justice system, right? Redlining, all of these different things, nothing happens in a vacuum. These are all of the traumas and stressors that would make it hard for someone to who has been impacted by the war on drugs to then go turn around and have their own dispensary. And so in recognition of that, the government not only threw out marijuana convictions, restricted folks' record, the access to people's records, but also made sure that there was money there and special loans and a certain amount of licenses that were dedicated for minority growers and minority distributors and minority dispensaries. That is an example of legislation that is informed by trauma. Another example that I would give, I guess more locally to Atlanta, is an example around the jail. That was a trauma-informed because we were literally hearing from the voices of people who had previously been in that jail, who influenced how this campaign was going to move forward and what the policies were going to be around this jail. And so now to close the jail is not just enough, but to repurpose it into something that serves community is moving in a way that is trauma-informed. I hope that answers your question.
It certainly does. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. Thank you, Larry. Alicia, there was a question, what resources, if any, can be made available to community gatekeepers to help them advocate for testing when people are turned away?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I think that there are a couple of things. Number one, start by working with those local county and state health departments. Many of the public coronavirus testing sites are going to be managed by the health department. And even if it's not a public health site, even if it's a private or commercial site, informing them that there were challenges getting tested at those sites so that they can serve as the liaison to making sure that those barriers are removed. And so, as I said earlier, many of us are going to have to serve as ambassadors within our communities because folks are not going to have those connections with the health departments. They're not going to know who they need to reach out to, but you do. And so ensuring that those barriers do get eliminated. The second thing is being able to talk with those sites directly and, building a rapport, identifying a lead at those locations to let them know, that this is what's being reported to the community and ensuring that folks don't have these challenges as they try to access testing. And then the third option will be if everything else fails. We talked about sometimes how the media may not be working for us, but this is an opportunity to go to the media, about people trying to access testing, supporting their communities and their families by knowing their status, and they are being denied.
Thank you so much. Leisha, one more for you. Earlier you talked about the intersection of HIV and COVID, and you gave examples of how the media kind of perpetuated those stories in different ways that didn't make it relevant to Black people. Is there any advice for people watching news media now on how to decipher through those messages to get to the meat of what needs to be?
Yes, you were fading in and out, Damon, a little bit, but I think what you're saying, was there any way for, how we utilize those stories to get to the core of what's happening within our communities?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that I noticed early on is as the media was sharing stories about COVID-19, that all of the stories were from the white community. The people who are transitioning or people who were recovering. And so when there were myths or conspiracy theories or, whatever within the community saying, oh, Black people can't get COVID-19. That was one of the things that I heard early on because, the color of our skin was our protective factor against COVID-19. And I've learned not to dispel myths because the origin may have some relevance or people have come up with, a perception of why they feel the way that they feel. And that perception is indeed their reality. But the media was supporting that because you didn't see stories of Black people or Black families that were dealing with this virus. And so that's an example of, how the media, of course, was working against us, the same way that we saw 40 years ago when we talked about HIV, that this, disease was among gay white men. And so Black communities, finally, we're saying finally, something we don't lead, right? Something that doesn't impact us, when all along, we were seeing cases among Black people from the very beginning of this epidemic. And so here we are 40 years later, and you hear health educators, then they talk about that this disease is not a gay white male disease. And it is unfortunate because it appears that those are the stories that the public remember. They remember that first story, and so we have to dispel those myths 50 years later.
If I may be able to also just add on to that, it's unfortunate because we have to do, as Black folks who are committed to the health of Black people, we got to do a lot of work because One, it's the historic medical mistrust, right? Just down the street in Atlanta, if you go over to Alabama, the Tuskegee experiments happened. Like, my mom was born in 72. That was still going on when, in relatively like modern history, right? There are Black people who remember the lies that were told by the U.S. government as pertains to the Tuskegee experiments. And so when we get there's already this historic mistrust, right? That's compounded with it creates this perfect storm, the historic mistrust with a president that does not give clear information, that gives inaccurate information intentionally, that gives information that could cause people to die, right? And then you have folks who, like the mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, who are committed to keeping residents safe, who's giving accurate information. And so then as a citizen, you are now, you have this responsibility of trying to decipher through who is giving you accurate information. Do I believe my mayor? Well, she's just the mayor, but normally I would listen to the president or the governor, but it seems like everything's so hyper-politicized that we can't trust that the information that they're going to give is accurate. So that is why, those of us who are invested in community health have to be always sharing accurate information on our social media accounts, that even when it's uncomfortable, we have to wade into social media discussions where there's inaccurate narratives and information that is being given. And then also we have to let it be known and create doubt over the elected officials that we know aren't giving information to our people that's accurate. So, for example, I have completely been trolling, for the older folks on the call who don't know what trolling is, maybe joning. I've been completely trolling and joning our governor of Georgia as being incompetent, as being not factual, and as not being a source of information that you should listen to without verifying it somewhere else first.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Devin. I'm calling you.
Yeah,
Daniel.
That happens all the time. It's okay.
Right.
It's because Daniel's really good looking like me.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we have another question. Are viral serology screenings inclusive of HIV, HCV, and hepatitis B, especially with communities of color?
Now, I think that is a high level medical question. Is there anyone from the Morehouse School of Medicine that can respond to that?
Yes, I was going to say I'll have Dr. Chen respond back to you, Mr. Wade. Okay, another question is, if we are aware of the trauma and talk of it all the time, when will we inform public policy from a strengths-based approach? If we know what works for Black people, inform policies as to not what's wrong, but what do the people need to get to where they need to be.
Yeah, I think trauma I also don't want people to feel like having policy that is informed by our previous traumas is living in the past. But when we continue to see that we are in a lot of the same places, it means that we have not truly dealt with the trauma of our past, right? And so that means that also that policy that, for example, I see progressive public policy all the time that is offered by legislators that would claim that they're progressive, but because they have no we know the trauma. We know these experiences as Black people. But oftentimes when the majority of legislators and policymakers don't look like us, and so just like your coworker at work, when you think, how could you not know this about Black people? How could you not know that we have gone through these things? There's no exception for that legislator that's from Rome, Georgia, that is voting on a piece of legislation that impacts people that live in South DeKalb County. And if they have no knowledge and that their policymaking framework is not informed and grounded by advocates who inform these folks as we are demanding these very progressive and future forward thinking legislation, well, what's the justification? It can't just be because, we say it's good public policy, because I'll let you know this right now. As someone who works at the state capitol, quite frequently, I see good public policy all the time that does not get passed. And so it being good public policy doesn't mean that that the legislators are going to do it. That's just not the reality of how our political system works. And so oftentimes it does have to be grounded in, well, not only is this good public policy, but this is good public policy because it actually addresses some of the structural and historic racism issues that we have not addressed and we've allowed to persist on and on and on and on and on. The last piece that I will also say is that to center the trauma also is to center the individual that's impacted by the public policy, right? A lot of times we as advocates feel like we have all of the answers because we are advocates who also sit within Black community, but we also have a certain level of privilege and access. And we can't do this work without directly impacted people a part of it. We would not have been able to close the Atlanta City Detention Center if we did not center the trauma of the people who have been impacted by the Atlanta City Detention Center. And so that does mean having folks talk through what those things are, so that way on the other side of it, we can get to the public policy intervention, but we can also have a greater level of ownership around the public policy intervention because it speaks to these unaddressed things that are individual traumas, that are collective family traumas, and that are collective community traumas. So I hope that answers the perspective.
Okay. What do Black people need to see before they should have confidence in reopening businesses and other establishments?
I think one of the first things that we got to see is more testing. You know, that if we look at Georgia, use Georgia as an example, there has been about 100,000 tests that's been done, which represents 1% of the 10 million people in this state. And so how do you make decisions about the state is ready to open when you only know the status of 1%? That means 99% of Georgians don't know, you know, I almost said HIV, it just comes so naturally, don't know their COVID-19 status. And so until we see more testing, we're not ready to open up. And then when testing occurs, there has to be a completion of the demographic form so that we can see, you know, where folks are being diagnosed. We can see what communities need additional resources and support to reduce the infection rates within those zip codes and those jurisdictions. And right now, we don't have that data to support it.
Yeah, I know that you know, for a lot of folks, opening up is not just an issue of public health, but it is also an issue of economics, right? Not everybody has, you know, I have the privilege as a business owner that my business is not a front-facing business. So I don't have a storefront that I have to operate, and the nature of our contracts allow us to continue to, in our work, allow us to continue working because we're doing things like this, for example, right? But we also, this is why I really encourage people to reevaluate as folks who are doing public health work, as folks who are doing HIV work, as folks that are doing work with Black people. We do have to reevaluate our relationship with capitalism in its current form, because capitalism is the only reason why we are moving like a freight train towards opening these states when we're not ready to open these states. And when other countries like Canada recognize that, right, and recognize the need to incorporate some democratic socialist principles, like ensuring that people don't just get a one-time $1,200 check, but that they get a $2,000 monthly check so that they can afford to stay home, that we suspend mortgage payments and rent payments and utility payments during this crisis so that people can afford to stay home. And so it's really important. I know a lot of times public health folks and health, you know, folks who are in the sphere of community health don't necessarily look at their role as really talking about economics. It is, because our people are going to be impacted the worst if we move forward under this very greed-centered capitalist framework that pushes people to the side and pushes profits to the front. And that is what happens when you live in that type of structure, where you will have a governor that says, even though the cases are increasing, even though we have not done the level of testing that we're supposed to, Even though all of these things, we will continue to move forward because it is more important to make a buck. But for those of us that know better, we have to not only just know better, but actively incorporate within our advocacy work as those who are, defenders of the community health, that this structure around like profiting off of healthcare is not sustainable for like ending this pandemic. This structure of unchecked capitalism and greed that puts jobs and having to go to work and pay a mortgage over the health of all of us, it cannot continue if the goal is to truly end this pandemic.
Last but not least, and we're going to let everybody go because we're approaching 3 p.m. For both of you all, what advice can you give to the people on the call, to participants on this webinar, to give back to communities of color or communities who just don't necessarily believe that this is a pandemic that impacts us on any level? So what advice can we give to the participants to give back or share in their communities?
Devin, you already got the floor. You want to start?
Sure. I was waiting on you. So I think some advice is really important to, again, trauma. To explore trauma is to explore your history, right? Particularly as a Black person. And so we've got to walk people through, because clearly to say in one vein, that we like, let me put it this way. I believe that the lack of, when I hear people who are Black who say that this is not a serious pandemic, it is because they do not truly understand their history and don't truly understand the history of like pandemics in this country and how it impacts Black people. But there's a reason why we say when America gets a cold, the Black America gets the flu. And so I think it's walking people through very recent history around how you ought not, it is not in the best interest of you as an individual and your family and your community to take light of this pandemic. And so to do that, I think, is to reinforce it with the historical examples and narratives that reinforce that this is something that we have to take seriously. And so I would say lean into the trauma. Don't run from it. It may feel like, oh, we're always carrying around this thing of trauma, but we're carrying around because we haven't actually opened up the suitcase and sorted through it. And so let's sort through the trauma. Let's like get in the face of it. Let's get comfortable with it. Let's sit down with it, so that way we can actually have more control over it. And I think we can't do that until we are in a place where we're comfortable having those type of conversations and really exploring our history in a deeper and more intentional way, so that we can transform our future.
There's really nothing else I can add to what Devin said.
I don't believe that. Oh, you can add
no, I'm positive, because it is true, and I think back to when we first started talking to folks about HIV, and when you would ask people in the room how many people knew someone with HIV, and only a few hands would go up, and the conversation was so difficult, and people were having, a hard time accepting and embracing that this was in our community. And then you fast forward 40 years later and you ask that same question, and everybody's hand goes up in the room. Correct. And there can be 2 to 3 different generations in the room. Mm-hmm. And folks all know somebody who is living with HIV. And so we don't want history to repeat itself. We don't want every family to have to say, well, yes, I'm aware of the impact of COVID-19 in Black communities because I have experienced that, and so we do have to look at ways. The message matters, but the messenger is even more important. Yes. And whoever is taking that message to our communities, that will be the determining point whether folks are open to accept or shut down because they don't trust.
And vote in your upcoming primaries. Vote in your upcoming primaries. Vote by mail. Vote by mail. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. People got COVID-19 trying to vote. They're trying to scare us away from voting, y'all. Don't be afraid. Vote by mail if you can. And it may look very different depending on where you're coming from. But in Georgia, Just Google My Voter Page if you haven't gotten your absentee ballot request form. And complete the census. Yes, Henry, complete the census. Complete the census. Absolutely. Yes.
I just want to take this time to thank you all of our presenters for presenting their hearts and their expertise. It's amazing to see this beautiful panel of Black people. I feel so affirmed as a Black person and so proud and honored to be in the community with y'all and honored to be a recipient, a beneficiary of your work. Just stay beautiful, stay Black, and very intentional about your work. I just thank you for this space, and thank you all for attending. You will receive an evaluation form. Please fill out the evaluation. It allows us to continue to do this work. And again, send some healing and some prayers to our brother Os. I love you all. Take care.
And thank you, Larry. You were a great facilitator. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Y'all make it so easy.
And your poetry, as always, is amazing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I love you all.
Love you too. Take care.